you doing this?
Why does anyone do anything?
We are talking Brute, 1976, directed by Marcel Walz. I should point out there's actually already a sequel for this coming out, Brute 1986. So anyway, Brute 1976 obviously is a movie that is homaging the likes of The Hills Have Eyes and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In fact, they reference Texas Chainsaw Massacre quite heavily in the film. And it takes a story of a group of models and photographers who are going on a photo shoot out in the desert. And upon kind of taking these kind of photos and stuff, they happen across a deserted ghost town, or at least they initially think it's deserted. Of course, it is home to this kind of collection of oddballs, all of which who have murder on their mind, as well as a little bit of torture, and it is up to our dwindling group of protagonists to try and escape the clutches of this evil clan. What will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So, let's discuss. So, this is a relatively kind of lower budget movie, I would suggest. What works in this movie's favour? I have to say the main thing for me that I thought was the most impressive in this movie was this location of this kind of ghost town, rural, rundown area full of deserted cars and buildings and things like this, because there's actually quite a lot there. And I have to say it's a great location and really does, I think, go into that 70s kind of grindhouse ambience. And it's a lot of the kind of the... for example, the vehicles there are sort of age appropriate for the time, obviously, and I think it's actually quite a good setting and does feel very much like these sort of mountain men sort of style movies that we've seen. And there's good variety in sort of locations, and we have kind of a few underground caves and things like that. And I think just the general area here where they're kind of shooting is almost a character of it in itself. So I could have quite enjoyed that. I have to say, I think I don't want to give too much away in regards to the characters for a reason, because they don't really kind of let you know who the main protagonist is, first of all, I would say. So I'm not going to kind of spoil it here, but I have to say who ended up being our main protagonist, I actually could have quite liked this character. And it's a little bit different to maybe... what you've seen in the past to a degree. So I kind of quite liked that, and I thought the character and the characters in general of our kind of group of protagonists are quite fun. And some of them are actually like, they don't have some kind of stereotypes. There's, normally here you'll get like the complete douchey one, the mean one, things like that. And for example, generally speaking, this group of kind of people sort of get on. I mean, there's a few different sort of personality types, but it's kind of like they kind of get on with this job of taking these photographs and stuff like that, and just doing their job, and they all sort of get on well enough, and it's sort of played somewhat sort of tongue-in-cheek, but it's kind of down to earth enough where you feel like the characters don't seem like caricatures. And they do seem kind of somewhat sort of well realised characters to a degree, at least in the context of a kind of low budget Backwoods style slasher movie at the very least. So I thought the characters were quite fun. In particular, who ends up being our kind of a main protagonist, I think adds an interesting dynamic. There's even a little bit of discourse about, and again I don't want to go too much into it, but there's almost a little bit of social commentary in the movie. Don't worry, it doesn't beat you around the head, but I actually think it represents two modes of thinking, and that I thought was quite good. And then we almost have an argument of ideologies, but not in a kind of like left versus right way. Let me just kind of say that again. I don't want to necessarily spell things out, but I actually did think it had some interesting sort of little kind of like nuggets here and there in regards to kind of some of the dialogue and stuff like that, where, you know, there is some interesting sort of stuff sprinkled in through the kind of the general kind of like, I'm gonna kill you and running away and screams and things like that. So yeah, so there's an interesting little bit of kind of commentary on the times of the 70s, sort of pop culture, you know, civil rights, social commentary, all sorts of different things. Again, nothing is too sort of banging you over the head with it, and I actually do think they kind of just touch on it just enough where it's sort of, you'll notice this sort of little bit of points here and there, but then they kind of move on. So that I all think was pretty good. I think the acting is fair in this movie. Again, it's kind of tongue-in-cheek. It's not exactly like gritty, realistic portrayals of people here. It's sort of somewhat played for campiness to a degree. But I have to say, again, if you can go into this movie with that mindset, I think, you know, it's for more of an enjoyable. Like, it's not like the grittiness of, for example, the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which everyone was dead straight. So you kind of have a little bit more of a sort of romp vibe to it, to a degree. Not that it's overly sort of, you wouldn't call this a horror comedy exactly, but there's just a little bit of sort of, admittedly maybe more modern sensibilities in it. But I do think, you know, there is a good attempt here to get a 70s vibe, but maybe some of the kind of the lighter touches will remind you a little bit more of a kind of a modern sense in regards to some of the kind of the general tone of the film. But that being said, I do think they have a fairly kind of fun idea here of the kind of the 70s. It's a little bit enhanced, shall we say, a little bit over the top at times. But again, that this movie is not trying to be necessarily a subtle movie or anything like that. But I think it's good enough to, you know, to kind of like reminisce about this time period without it being necessarily like a document about the times of the 70s and things like this. So that's all kind of quite fun. There's a standout scene in this movie which is quite strong, and I will say it very much made me wince. There is one very strong scene here in multiple ways, actually, more than one, that I was surprised was actually included, because I didn't think you could get away with that, I have to say. And it's going to be the standout scene. But I won't say what it is. Interestingly though, there's nothing else that comes close to that in regards to kind of gore. So you have one scene which is particularly kind of like explicit, shall we say, in a couple of different ways, but then again the movie never really goes that explicit again, which is interesting, and that'll come on to the negatives. But yeah, there is that one standout sort of scene. These kind of individuals, these mountain men, whatever you want to call them, these crazies, these backwoods folks, they kind of look, you know, scary and intimidating and things like that, and we always get a little bit of internal politics within them in regards to the kind of the hierarchy and things like that. Just a glimpse, nothing too much. So, you know, it has a fun vibe to it, a fun romp, if you like, a kind of backwoods slasher sort of style movie. For most people, if you don't mind a kind of a lower budget film, you know, so that's my positive. So let's move on to now maybe what doesn't work. As I mentioned, I think the vibe here, it doesn't quite catch the 70s. It kind of feels like they've done a lot of window dressing for the 70s, but some of the sort of just the tone of the movie feels a little more modern, and as such, it kind of betrays that 70s, that genuine 70s vibe. A relatively minor point, and what I'm going to say next is relatively minor, but it's there that the fact that I noticed it. I think this movie really doesn't kind of quite hammer home or nail the depictions of these scary individuals. What do I mean? Take the scene at the end of Texas Chainsaw Massacre where Leatherface is kind of spinning round with that chainsaw. you genuinely feel he's an unhinged individual. What he's doing is not performative necessarily. He is just kind of being this crazy individual. Also, what he's wearing, the skin mask and everything like that, he's not wearing it to be scary to people necessarily. He's just wearing it because that's what he wants to wear. And you can get away with it in a movie. And then Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it sets that film for the tone, and I think it kind of feels like that character has earned that. Here, the group of weirdos, whatever you want to call them, feel more performative. They feel like scare attraction performers to me. Why do I say that? Let me give you a couple of examples to kind of enunciate that. The masks. We have this group of individuals wearing these scary masks, but they look like scary masks. They look like kind of like horror masks. Whilst again, if you compare it to Leatherface, he's wearing someone else's skin. To him, it's kind of like he's putting on someone else's face. Here we've got like sharp teeth and there's like skull masks and stuff, and thinking they've almost tried a little bit too hard to make these props and these kind of costumes a little bit too like designed to be scary, if that makes sense. And as such, it looks a little bit false because, okay, you know, in this kind of deserty kind of like wilderness, what are people? Why are they wearing these masks for a start? I mean, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it was only one person that wore a mask, which kind of made that special. Here they're all doing it, and they're all like these masks that look like they're being. I mean, they don't look like shot book masks exactly, but they look like they're masks that have been made to be scary. Again, that you'd maybe see in a scare attraction, and it kind of feels like it doesn't really feel genuine. I mean, what are they doing? And these people just waiting around in this dusty wilderness with these masks on for hapless passers-by to kind of wander in. And again, they're too over-designed. And an example, we have a character that's waving around a chainsaw, and he's kind of got it above his head, and he's kind of waving it around. And again, if you compare that to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where you feel when Leatherface did that, it wasn't performative. It was just him being this kind of like out of his mind character that was just kind of in his own little world. Here it feels performative. It feels like you've got a scare attraction employee coming to kind of scare you, and as such it doesn't really feel like this person is genuinely kind of like a crazed lunatic or what have you. Again, it might seem relatively minor that, but it just detracts from that sort of that visceral feeling that a movie like this could possibly have. You know, and you look at a more modern example like Wrong Turn, for example, that had that visceral feel. This is lacking from that film. It feels more campy because I think the design of the movie doesn't quite nail the grittiness, the grindhouse, and this kind of slightly sort of more camp tone to it. Again, makes it feel like not as impactful as a movie it could have been. It is still somewhat of an enjoyable movie, but it doesn't really feel visceral at any point apart from this one scene which, well, you'll know when you see it. I have to say, I think there's some plot points in the movie that seem a little far-fetched. People's changing allegiances, for example, people's motivations for doing things, kind of like a reveal that happens. I don't know, it just feels like it's stretching it a little bit. I mean, okay, we know when we watch a horror film or a fantasy film, our expectations of reality, we kind of put it to a side. But you know, you want to believe the story that's being told to you. You want to kind of get invested in the sort of the story and in its believability. But there are some things here, and it's decisions made by characters that I just felt didn't quite land for me, and they just felt not genuine, a little bit silly at times, not particularly, you know, well thought out or believable. Even the reasons for these, I mean, we get like a monologue about why these crazed individuals are all together, and it seems, again, it just seems a little bit over the top. And thinking, why would someone? Because a lot of these characters seem relatively, you know, sane. And let's just put it like that. They can enunciate words and sentences and seem to converse completely fine, but they just seem the explanation for them being there seems a little far-fetched to me, and not particularly kind of well thought out. There are also, to me, the pacing of the movie lags at certain points. I mean, it kind of builds up these scary moments, and it kind of starts to try to kind of ramp up the tension, because I think some of the tonal visuals don't really help. But also then we have these laggy moments where I feel that the sort of tension diffuses, because we have this downtime that sort of ends up sort of being a little bit, it never really keeps the tension going for that long, and it leaves too long a gap before the next thing, and the tension dissipates, and therefore you're not really at the edge of your seat watching this, kind of like thinking, oh, okay. And the general sort of the movie has this kind of lower budget feel. Maybe not so much in the location or anything like that, but just the general. It feels like it's been shot relatively quickly. Let me put it like that. It just feels like they've accepted some sequences that just don't feel like they particularly worked as well, or could have been done another take, or things could have been put together for it to be slightly kind of more dynamic. And as such, I think this movie never really achieves what it set out to do. You know, it's obviously meant to be a homage to the kind of the grindhouse slasher movies, obviously, with the most famous example being the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but it never really sort of gets up to those levels, and it really does feel somewhat like a paler imitation to a degree. It's enjoyable, you know, to a point, but for example, the modern remake of The Hills Have Eyes far exceeds this, and that arguably is a higher budget movie, but that was still a few years ago now. This one, it doesn't quite ever really even get to those standards, or like Wrong Turn or things like that. But yeah, it just feels it's lacking a little bit to me, and I think some of the tonal issues were probably here, for me, made this movie lack bite, and I think that was because we have such a kind of explicit scene in one area, and it never really matches that again. Well, you had this one scene, so it's going to get a rating for that one scene. So why not do it at the rest of the scenes? A lot of the kills here are blood splurting out, you know, but you don't see the actual, like, you know, the actual kills themselves. A lot of it is kind of off-screen, with just kind of like blood spray or something like that. Some of the props don't look particularly strong. There's a character that wears like, it's meant to be the skin of this woman, where he's got like her boobs. It literally looks like someone's got like a latex like body stocking or something, and just wearing that. So yeah, again, it is a lower budget movie than maybe some of the films I've mentioned, but nonetheless, it kind of, you know, it doesn't quite land. Overall, it ends up being not a bad film. I will say that. I think if you are a fan of the backwoods slasher subgenre, there's enough here to kind of like to enjoy, and you'll probably get out. You know, it's maybe worth a watch. Have you seen it? Would you see it based on what I've told you? Please let me know your thoughts, and I look forward to seeing you next time.